The town of Pinecrest was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was home to just under 3,000 people who prided themselves on knowing everyone's business, which was why the disappearance of Bus 37 shook the community to its core. It was supposed to be a routine trip. 30 students from Pinecrest High's science club were returning from a regional competition in the neighboring county. They'd placed second overall, a fact that teacher Marion Reeves had proudly texted to her colleagues before they began the journey home. The storm came without warning. Meteorologists would later call it a microburst event, a sudden, violent downpour that transformed the winding mountain roads into treacherous rivers within minutes. The last communication from the bus was a brief radio call from driver Frank Larson at 4:53 p.m. Heavy rain on Route 16. Visibility's shot. Might need to pull over until this passes. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Storms weren't uncommon. In these parts, especially in late autumn, when warm air from the valley collided with the colder mountain climate. Parents expected delays. Some even made jokes about the kids getting an unexpected camping trip. By 7:30 p.m., when the bus still hadn't arrived and calls to both Marion and Frank went straight to voicemail, Principal Diane Walker contacted the sheriff's office. By 9 p.m., every parent had been notified. By midnight, search and rescue teams were combing Route 16, fighting against the still pouring rain and encroaching darkness. They found nothing. No skid marks indicating a vehicle had veered off the road, no broken guardrails, no debris. Bus 37, with its bright yellow paint and 30 young passengers, had seemingly evaporated into the mountain air. The first press conference was held the next morning outside Pinecrest High. Sheriff Tom Mullins, his uniform still splattered with mud from the night's search, faced a wall of terrified parents and bewildered reporters. "We have reason to believe the bus may have taken an alternate route due to flooding on sections of Route 16, he explained, his voice betraying his own doubt. "We're expanding our search to include all possible detours and secondary roads." In the front row, Mark Reynolds clutched a photo of his daughter Emily. She'd sent him a selfie from the bus just 30 minutes before the storm hit. All smiles with her science project medal hanging around her neck. He couldn't reconcile that image with the possibility that she was now lost somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding their town. By day 3, the search had expanded to include neighboring counties, state police, and even military personnel with infrared equipment. Volunteers poured in from surrounding towns, forming human chains to comb through the dense underbrush alongside the mountain roads. Helicopters buzzed overhead from dawn until dusk, their searchlights cutting through the mist that seemed to permanently shroud the mountains now. On the evening news, experts speculated about what might have happened. A catastrophic mechanical failure. A flash flood carrying the bus into a ravine. Some even suggested the driver might have made a grave error, taking them off-road to avoid a washed-out section of highway. Each theory was more devastating than the last. 1 week after the disappearance, the first memorial appeared outside the high school, 30 white candles arranged in a circle, each bearing the name of a missing student. Nobody was ready to call it a memorial yet. They still used words, like tribute and vigil, but as days stretched into weeks, hope began to wither. The official search was scaled back after 2 weeks. Resources were limited, officials explained. They would continue investigating, following leads, but the active search and rescue operation couldn't continue indefinitely. Parents and community members picked up the slack, organizing their own search parties every weekend. Mark Reynolds quit his job at the lumber mill to search full-time, often staying in the mountains for days, surviving on granola bars and filtered stream water. A month after the disappearance, authorities convened a special town hall meeting. The official theory now centered on a catastrophic accident in one of the deeper ravines, possibly followed by heavy vegetation coverage due to landslides from the storm. Without the exact location, recovery would be nearly impossible. The town of Pinecrest began the impossible task of mourning without closure. 30 empty desks remained in classrooms, 30 bedrooms remained untouched in silent homes, and somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding them, Bus 37 kept its secrets. No one could have imagined that 3 years later, those secrets would begin to surface, more terrifying than anyone could have predicted. Mark Reynolds stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, watching the shadows play across the cracked paint. 397 days since the disappearance. He knew, because he marked each morning with a small X on the calendar hanging in the kitchen, right next to Emily's school photo. Sleep had become a foreign concept. Instead, Mark existed in a perpetual state of exhaustion, drifting between consciousness and something darker. His wife Sarah had left 6 months ago, unable to bear the weight of their shared grief, pulling in opposite directions. She wanted to heal, to remember Emily through the good times. Mark couldn't let go. The official investigation had concluded 3 months after Bus 37 vanished. A formal report cited catastrophic weather event resulting in vehicle loss and multiple casualties. No bodies recovered, no definitive crash site identified. Just theories, probabilities, and a neatly packaged explanation that allowed the authorities to move on. Mark threw back the covers and padded barefoot to Emily's room. He did this every night, sitting on the edge of her bed, touching her things. The softball trophy from 7th grade, the dog-eared copy of The Hobbit she'd been reading the week before she disappeared. Tonight, he pulled open her desk drawer and removed the small leather journal she'd kept. He knew every entry by heart, but still found comfort in the looping handwriting, the exclamation points, the occasional heart dotting an I. The final entry was from the morning of the competition. Nervous about presenting today, but Mr. Reeves says our project is the best he's seen in years. A wave of anger washed over him as he remembered yesterday's conversation with Sheriff Mullins. "Mark, we've been through this," Mullins had said, not bothering to hide his exasperation. "The case isn't officially closed, but we've exhausted every lead." "You're telling me a 40-foot school bus just disappeared without a trace?" Mark had demanded. "That doesn't happen, Tom, not without someone covering it up." The sheriff's expression had hardened then. "Don't go down that road, Mark. Conspiracy theories won't bring Emily back." But it wasn't a theory when Mark had evidence. Evidence the sheriff refused to acknowledge. Like the fact that Bus 37's GPS tracking system had been disabled 2 days before the trip, or that Frank Larson, the driver, had called in sick that morning, but somehow ended up behind the wheel anyway, or the mysterious military vehicles spotted in the area just hours after the disappearance. Mark made his way to the spare bedroom, now converted into what Sarah had called his obsession room before she left. Maps covered every wall, red pins marking searched areas, yellow pins indicating potential routes, blue pins showing where witnesses had reported seeing the bus before it vanished. Stacks of weather reports, terrain surveys, and statements from locals filled plastic bins labeled by date. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, clicking through the digital evidence he'd gathered. An email from Marion Reeves to the principal complaining about last-minute changes to the trip itinerary. A meteorological report showing the storm had been unusually localized, almost as if it had targeted that specific mountain range. His phone buzzed. A text from David Chen, whose son Michael had been on the bus. "Found something. Call me." David was one of the few parents who hadn't given up. The others had held funerals with empty caskets, erected gravestones over vacant plots, and tried to move forward. Mark understood their need for closure, but couldn't accept it for himself. Not without proof. He dialed immediately. "I got access to archived satellite imagery," David said without preamble. There's a 3-hour window missing during the storm. The company claims it was due to atmospheric interference, but I checked other satellites. They had clear images. Mark's heart raced. Someone deleted the footage. Or classified it. Either way, it confirms what we've suspected. They're hiding something, Mark whispered. He hung up and moved to the window, staring out at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere out there were answers. Somewhere out there was Emily. The town had moved on. Memorial scholarships had been established in the students. Names. A stone monument stood in the park, 30 names etched into its surface. Life in Pinecrest had found a new normal. But Mark Reynolds was left behind, trapped in the moment between they're running late and they're gone. And he would remain there until he uncovered the truth that everyone else had stopped looking for. Dawn was breaking as he reached for his hiking boots. Another day, another search, another chance to prove them all wrong. The morning after Bus 37 disappeared, over 200 volunteers gathered at Pinecrest High's parking lot. They arrived, in pickup trucks and SUVs, carrying flashlights, walkie-talkies, and determination. Local hunting guides, retired military personnel, parents, teachers, a cross-section of the community united by urgency. Sheriff Tom Mullins tried to establish order, dividing them into search grids along Route 16 and potential detour paths. State police helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors slicing through the lingering mist. The storm had passed, but it left behind treacherous conditions, washed-out roads, unstable slopes, and thick mud that sucked at boots and vehicle tires. "Remember," Mullins shouted through his bullhorn, "we're looking for a bright yellow school bus. It's 40 feet long and hard to miss. If you find something, don't approach, radio it in." What should have been a straightforward search operation quickly descended into chaos. The mountain roads, already winding and treacherous, under normal conditions, had been transformed overnight. Landslides blocked access to entire sections of Route 16. Bridges were compromised, some completely washed away. The search team spent more time trying to navigate the terrain than actually searching. By noon, the first federal officials arrived. FBI agents specializing in missing persons cases and representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board. They set up a command center in the high school gymnasium. Walls covered with maps and satellite imagery. Their presence should have been reassuring. Instead, it underscored the gravity of the situation. "The first 48 hours are critical," FBI agent Diana Wright told the assembled parents that evening. "We're allocating every available resource to find your children." But bureaucracy moved slower than the mountain streams still swollen from the storm. Jurisdictional disputes arose between local authorities and federal agents. The search grid system broke down when teams discovered that their maps didn't match the post-storm reality. Communication failures were frequent. Radio signals couldn't penetrate certain valleys, and cell service was non-existent across most of the search area. Mark Reynolds watched in growing frustration as precious hours ticked by. He had joined a team searching the eastern ridge, an area where the bus might have diverted to avoid flooded lowlands. His group leader, a park ranger named Peterson, kept them moving at an agonizingly methodical pace. "We need to cover more ground," Mark argued on the second day, pointing to a valley they hadn't yet approached. "They could be down there, waiting for help. And if we rush and miss evidence, what then?" Peterson countered. "This is how search operations work, Mr. Reynolds. Thorough and systematic." But thorough and systematic wasn't finding Emily or any of the other missing children. By day 5, the search had expanded to cover nearly 300 square miles of mountainous terrain. Specialized teams with cadaver dogs joined the effort, a development that sent a wave of dread through the waiting families. National news. Crews set up camp in the high school parking lot, broadcasting hourly updates that contained no actual news. The weather turned against them again on day 7. Heavy rain returned, grounding the helicopters and forcing some search teams to retreat from unstable areas. A rescue worker was seriously injured when a slope collapsed beneath him, a sobering reminder of the dangers the search parties faced. It was day 9 when the first official acknowledged what many had begun to fear. State Police Captain Andrea Hines, addressing the increasingly desperate parents, said the words no one wanted to hear. "We have to consider the possibility that the bus left the search area entirely, or that it's in a location that's simply not visible from the air or accessible routes." Translation: they might never find it. The most devastating blow came on day 14, when Governor Mills visited the command center. After a private meeting with search officials, he emerged with a grim announcement. "Based on expert assessment and the extensive search conducted, we're transitioning from a rescue operation to a recovery mission." The words fell like stones in the gymnasium. Recovery, not rescue. They were no longer looking for survivors. Federal resources began to withdraw by the end of week 3. The command center relocated to a smaller room in the sheriff's office. Daily briefings became weekly status updates, each one shorter than the last. What had begun as the largest search operation in the region's history faded into a periodic review of maps and occasional flyovers when weather permitted. The official search ended not with answers, but with a press release thanking all involved for their tireless efforts. For the families left behind, it was the cruelest form of abandonment, being told that finding their children was no longer a priority worthy of action. 6 months after the official search ended, Mark Reynolds sat in his living room surrounded by stacks of paper. Police reports, witness statements, weather data, topographical maps, the detritus of a half-year's obsession. Outside, Pinecrest was moving on. Inside, time stood still. He'd requested the official investigation file through a Freedom of Information Act request, expecting resistance. Instead, a manila envelope arrived containing documents so heavily redacted they resembled abstract art rather than information. Black lines obscured crucial details, timestamps, locations, entire witness statements. "What are they hiding?" he muttered, comparing the official report to his own notes. The inconsistencies had started small. At first, Mark thought they were simple errors born from the chaos of the search. But the pattern that emerged was too deliberate to ignore. The bus's last confirmed location, for instance. The official report placed it on Route 16, 5 miles east of Miller's Ridge, but the gas station attendant who'd spoken to the driver when they stopped for a bathroom break insisted it had been heading west, toward Craven's Pass instead. Then there was the weather data. The storm had been unusually localized, concentrated almost exclusively over a 15-mile radius that happened to include the exact stretch of road where the bus vanished. Meteorologists called it an anomaly. Mark called it suspicious. Most troubling were the discrepancies in the communications timeline. According to the report, driver Frank Larson's final radio call came at 4:53 p.m., yet cell tower data showed Marion Reeves's phone active until 5:32 p.m., nearly 40 minutes later. If the bus had crashed or been swept away during the storm, how was the teacher's phone still connecting to a tower? Mark circled that detail in red marker and added it to his wall. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. David Chen stood on the porch, clutching a leather briefcase, his eyes ringed with the same exhaustion that plagued Mark. "I got the maintenance records," David said without greeting, stepping inside. He spread the documents across Mark's kitchen table. Service logs for Bus 37 going back 3 years. "Look here," David pointed to entries from the week before the disappearance. 3 separate inspections in 5 days. That's unprecedented. Could be coincidence, Mark said, though he didn't believe it. And this? David flipped to another page. The GPS tracking system was replaced 2 days before the trip. The old one wasn't malfunctioning, they just swapped it out. Mark studied the signature at the bottom of the work order. This isn't the regular mechanic. No, David confirmed. I checked. Guy named Samuels. Doesn't work for the school district. No record of who authorized the work either. They added it to the growing web of inconsistencies. By the time Emily's birthday arrived, her 16th celebrated without her, Mark and David had compiled enough contradictions to fill a 3-inch binder. They weren't alone anymore either. Pamela Johnson, whose daughter Rebecca had been on the bus, joined their informal investigation after finding inconsistencies in her daughter's phone records. James Mercer, father of twins Tyler and Travis, contributed his expertise as a former rescue worker, questioning the search protocols that had been implemented. They met weekly in Mark's garage, comparing notes and theories. None of them used the word conspiracy aloud, but it hung in the air during their discussions. The breakthrough came 8 months after the disappearance, when James obtained the complete maintenance history for the mountain roads. Route 16 had been scheduled for closure the day after the field trip, a planned infrastructure project that never appeared in any of the official reports about the bus disappearance. They were going to tear up the entire eastern section, James explained, pointing to the work orders. Major structural concerns. Road shouldn't have been open at all. So why send a bus full of kids that way? Pamela asked. The question lingered unanswered, joining dozens of others on their investigation board. When Mark finally approached Sheriff Mullins with their findings, he was met with a wall of bureaucratic deflection. Mark, these are clerical errors, not evidence of some grand conspiracy, Mullins said, barely glancing at the binder. For your own sake, please consider grief counseling. But grief didn't explain why satellite imagery from that day had been classified. It didn't explain why Frank Larson's personnel file had disappeared from school records. It didn't explain why 3 military vehicles had been spotted on Forest Service roads hours before any official emergency response was initiated. The wall of questions grew taller, and somewhere behind it, Mark was certain, lay the truth about what happened to Bus 37 and the 30 souls aboard it. The metal detector gave a faint beep, barely audible over the autumn wind whistling through the pines. Mark Reynolds knelt, brushing away fallen leaves and digging his fingers into the cold soil. His hands, once soft from office work, were now calloused and weathered, the hands of a man who had spent 3 years searching the wilderness. He unearthed a soda can, crushed and rusted. Another false alarm. He tossed it into his pack. He always packed out trash and continued along the ridge. 3 years. 1,095 days of searching, questioning, and fighting against a world determined to forget. Pinecrest had moved on, as small towns must. The anniversary memorials grew smaller each year. Last month's vigil had drawn barely 30 people, most of them still grieving parents. Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket. David Chen's name flashed on the screen. "I'm at the coordinates," Mark answered, his breath fogging in the crisp air. "Nothing yet." "Keep looking," David replied, his voice tight with the same desperate hope that had sustained their search. The Rangers' report specifically mentioned unusual debris in that sector after the flooding last spring. Mark surveyed the landscape. He stood on a narrow ridge overlooking a steep ravine that didn't appear on any official map. They had discovered it 6 months ago when James Mercer, using topographical data and water flow models, identified previously unexplored drainage paths created by the storm. "I'll work my way down into the ravine," Mark said. "Should have enough daylight left." The descent was treacherous. Loose shale slid beneath his boots, and thorny underbrush tore at his clothing. 3 years ago, such terrain would have intimidated him. Now, It was just another Tuesday. His search team had dwindled to 4 dedicated members, himself, David, Chen, Pamela Johnson, and James Mercer. They had formed a bond stronger than friendship, forged in shared grief and purpose. While others accepted the official explanation, they alone continued the search, pooling their resources and expertise. Last month, they'd finally caught a break. A forest ranger filing a routine environmental report had noted unusual non-native metal fragments in an area well outside the original search perimeter. The report had been buried in administrative files until Pamela, working her connections at the Parks Department, discovered it. At the bottom of the ravine, Mark switched on his headlamp as shadows deepened in the late afternoon light. The metal detector swung in a practiced arc before him. Hours passed as he methodically covered the area, ignoring the growing cold and his rumbling stomach. The detector screamed. Mark dropped to his knees, heart pounding. The signal was strong, indicating something substantial beneath the surface. He scraped away layers of compacted soil and decaying vegetation, moving carefully to preserve whatever lay beneath. A flash of yellow. Not the dull yellow of autumn leaves, but the bright, unmistakable yellow of school bus paint. With trembling hands, Mark uncovered a metal panel approximately 2 feet square. Despite years of exposure to the elements, the distinctive color was unmistakable. Part of a district logo remained visible in the corner. "My God," he whispered, instantly recognizing the fragment. It was a section of the bus's side panel, torn away and carried nearly 7 miles from Route 16. His phone was out in an instant. "David, I found something, a piece of the bus." "Are you sure?" "Positive. And David, this isn't from a crash. The metal's been cut, clean edges, like it was removed deliberately." Silence hung on the line as the implications sank in. "Take photos," David finally said. "Document everything. We're on our way." By nightfall, the 4 of them huddled around a camp table in Mark's RV, examining the panel under bright lights. James traced the edge with an experienced finger. "These are tool marks," he confirmed. "Someone took this bus apart, methodically." Pamela's face was pale in the harsh light. "What does this mean?" "It means we've been right all along," Mark said, meeting each of their gazes. "This wasn't an accident. Someone took that bus, took our children, and made it disappear." He pinned a photo of the panel to their evidence board. "And now we have proof." David nodded slowly. "This changes everything. We're not just looking for a crash site anymore." "No," Mark agreed, a determined fire in his eyes. "We're looking for whoever did this, and they left us a trail to follow." As moonlight filtered through the RV windows, they began planning their next move. For the first time in 3 years, they had tangible evidence. Not just theories and inconsistencies, but a physical piece of the puzzle. The search for Bus 37 had entered a new phase, and Mark Reynolds would not stop until he uncovered the full truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge, painting the mountains in hues of gold and amber. Mist clung to the valleys, obscuring the depths below. Mark Reynolds checked his equipment one final time. Compass, GPS unit, satellite phone, first aid kit, 3 days' worth of provisions. This expedition would take them farther into the wilderness than they'd ever ventured before. "Everyone ready?" he asked, surveying the small group assembled in the clearing. David Chen adjusted his pack, the weight of technical equipment evident in his stance. 3 years of searching had transformed the former software engineer into a hardened outdoorsman, though his analytical mind remained his greatest asset. Beside him, Pamela Johnson secured her hiking poles, her face set with determination. James Mercer consulted a topographical map, marking their intended route with a red pen. "We have a 4-hour hike to reach the first search grid," James said. "Terrain gets rough after the second ridge." The newest member of their team, Dr. Elena Martinez, checked her medical supplies. A forensic anthropologist who had reached out after reading about their discovery of the bus panel, she brought scientific credibility they desperately needed. "Remember," Mark said, "we're looking for anything man-made. Fabric, metal, personal items. If you find something, document before moving it." They moved in single file up the narrow game trail, following the path indicated by their debris flow. Analysis. According to their calculations, if more pieces of the bus had been scattered by the same water patterns, this ravine would have channeled them toward the northern valley. The forest gradually thinned as they climbed, giving way to rocky outcroppings and stunted pines bent by constant wind. By mid-morning, they reached the first ridge, pausing to catch their breath and survey the expanse before them. "Look there!" David pointed to an unusual formation in the valley below. "That outcropping doesn't match the surrounding geology." Elena studied it through binoculars. "Could be man-made, worth checking." The descent into the valley was treacherous, loose shale sliding beneath their boots. Mark led carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. 3 hours later, they reached the formation David had spotted. "This isn't natural," James confirmed, examining the rocky structure. "These stones were placed deliberately." Elena brushed away years of accumulated debris, revealing what appeared to be a crude shelter built into the hillside. "Someone was here. Recently enough that this hasn't completely eroded." Mark's pulse quickened. "Search the area, 50-foot radius." They worked methodically, combing the ground for any sign of human presence. Pamela's voice broke the silence. 20 minutes later, "I found something!" They gathered around as she carefully extracted a tattered piece of fabric from beneath a fallen log. Though weathered and discolored, the pattern was unmistakable, the same plaid design as the pine crest. "High uniform skirts." Mark's hands trembled as he photographed the fabric in situ. "This is Rebecca's," Pamela whispered, recognizing her daughter's clothing. Elena bagged the fabric carefully. "We need to expand the search area." By late afternoon, they had recovered more evidence. A single tennis shoe, size 7, matching the brand Emily Reynolds had been wearing. A plastic hair clip with the Pinecrest mascot. A ballpoint pen from the science competition. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and carefully preserved. "They were here," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just debris carried by water. They were here, moving through this valley." The implications were staggering. The original search had never covered this area, believing it too remote from the bus's last known location. Yet here was proof that the students had somehow traveled miles from Route 16, deep into unmarked wilderness. As daylight faded, they set up camp beneath a rocky overhang. The mood was somber yet charged with purpose. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't chasing ghosts or theories. They were following a tangible trail. "Tomorrow we push further north," Mark said, studying their map by headlamp. If they continued in this direction, they would have reached the old mining district. "Why would they go that way?" Elena asked. "It leads away from civilization, deeper into the mountains." "Maybe they weren't moving voluntarily," James suggested quietly. The weight of his words settled over the camp. Mark stared into the small fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Tomorrow, they would venture into territory so remote it wasn't even properly mapped, the abandoned mining operations that had once dotted these mountains, forgotten by all but the oldest residents. As the others settled into their sleeping bags, Mark stepped out of the shelter and gazed up at the stars. Somewhere in these mountains were answers, and somewhere perhaps was Emily. "I'm coming," he whispered to the night. "Hold on. I'm coming. Giotto." Morning brought a heavy mist that clung to the mountainside, limiting visibility to mere yards. The search team packed their camp in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about yesterday's discoveries. Mark checked his GPS unit, confirming their northward route toward the abandoned mining district. "Weather report?" he asked David, who monitored their satellite communication. "Fog until mid-morning. Clear after that. No storms forecasted." They moved slowly through the mist, keeping close to avoid separation. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Steep inclines, unexpected drop-offs, and dense underbrush that seemed determined to impede their progress. By noon, they'd covered barely 2 miles, though the fog had lifted enough to reveal the vastness of the wilderness surrounding them. "Wait!" Elena called suddenly, crouching to examine something partially buried in the soil. "Look at this." The group gathered around as she carefully brushed away debris, revealing a weathered leather wallet. With gloved hands, she opened it, extracting a laminated school ID card. "Frank Larson," she read, showing them the bus driver's photo. "Employee ID from Pinecrest School District." Mark's heart raced as he photographed the wallet in place. This wasn't student evidence. This belonged to the adult responsible for the bus, and it was miles from where the bus should have been. "Check the rest of the wallet," James urged. Elena methodically removed each item: a few dollar bills, a credit card expired 3 years ago, a folded slip of paper. She carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a hand-drawn map. "This isn't a standard route," David said, comparing it to their topographical charts. "This shows a path that cuts northwest across the ridgeline, completely bypassing Route 16. Pamela's brow furrowed. "But that makes no sense. Why would Frank take an unmarked mountain road instead of the highway?" "Unless he was instructed to," Mark said quietly. Elena bagged the wallet and its contents. "There's more. Look at the ground here." She pointed to a subtle disturbance in the soil, a pattern of compression that trained eyes might recognize. "This is an old tire track, very old, but the dimensions are consistent with a large vehicle, possibly a bus." The team fell silent as the implications sank in. The driver hadn't just wandered off course accidentally. He had a map. He had planned to take this route. "We need to follow these tracks," Mark decided, a new urgency in his voice. "If the bus came this way intentionally, it changes everything about what happened that day." They spread out in a search pattern, moving carefully to preserve any potential evidence. The tire impressions appeared intermittently, faint ghosts in the soil that had somehow survived 3 years of mountain weather. They followed this trail for another mile before James called out from ahead, "I found something." The object lay half-buried beneath a fallen log, a dented metal lunchbox with the Pinecrest High School logo. Despite years of exposure, these catch still worked. Inside was a moldy sandwich, a decomposed apple, and a water bottle. A name was written in faded marker on the underside: Tyler Mercer. James's hands trembled as he held his son's lunchbox. He was here, right here. Mark placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, understanding the conflicting emotions, the validation of their search, and the painful reminder of loss. "There's something else," Eleanor said, examining the water bottle. "This isn't standard. Look at the marking." The bottle bore a small logo they didn't recognize, a stylized mountain peak with the letters ARF beneath it. "Alpine Research Facility," David read, already typing on his satellite-connected tablet. "It's a government installation, supposedly decommissioned in the 90s. Mark's mind raced. Where was it located? David zoomed in on his digital map. "About 4 miles northwest of our position, high security, very remote." "The map in Frank's wallet," Pamela said slowly. "It was leading there, wasn't it?" "Nodi, the pieces were beginning to align in a pattern none of them had anticipated. Frank Larson hadn't been lost. He'd been following directions to a supposedly abandoned government facility. Mark studied the surrounding mountains, their peaks disappearing into wisps of cloud. We changed course, northwest to this facility." The discovery had shifted their search from a rescue mission to something far more complex. As they altered their path to follow Frank's map, the question burned in Mark's mind. Why would a school bus driver deliberately take 30 children to a remote government installation during a storm? By late afternoon, they crested a ridge that gave them their first view of what lay ahead, a distant cluster of structures nestled in a valley, surrounded by chain-link fencing. The Alpine Research Facility. And somewhere within its perimeter lay the answers they sought. Night fell quickly in the mountains. The search team made camp a half-mile from the discovered tire tracks, planning to continue toward the Alpine Research Facility at first light. Mark took the first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small fire. The revelation about Frank Larson's planned detour had unsettled them all, transforming their understanding of what happened 3 years ago. Sleep came uneasily when Mark finally crawled into his tent after midnight. His dreams were filled with buses navigating impossible mountain paths, Emily's face pressed against the window, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear. Dawn arrived with a fine drizzle that dampened everything but their determination. They broke camp efficiently, a routine perfected over countless expeditions. Today's route would take them along a treacherous ridgeline, offering the most direct path to the mysterious facility. 2 hours into their hike, James raised his hand for a halt. Listen. Above the patter of rain came another sound, water rushing, powerful and close. They moved cautiously toward the noise until the terrain suddenly opened before them into a vast ravine, at least 60 feet deep and twice as wide. It cut across their path like a scar in the earth. Far below, white water churned violently between jagged rocks. "This isn't on any of our maps," David said, consulting his GPS. Elena stepped carefully to the edge, testing the stability. "This is recent formation, maybe from the same storm that hit when the bus disappeared." Mark surveyed the obstacle. "We need to find a crossing point." They followed the ravine's edge northward, searching for a narrower section. The rain intensified, turning the ground treacherous. After a half-mile, James spotted something protruding from the ravine wall about 20 feet down, a glint of metal catching the grey light. "There," he pointed, "something man-made." Mark secured a climbing rope to a sturdy tree and rappelled down the slick rock face. The metal object became clearer as he descended, part of a guardrail, bent and twisted, embedded in the ravine wall. But it wasn't just any guardrail. The distinctive yellow and black hazard stripes were unmistakable, the same type used on mountain roads to prevent vehicles from plunging over edges. "There was a road here," Mark called up to the others, his voice nearly lost in the sound of rushing water. "A road that's not on any of our maps." He examined the surrounding rock. The ravine walls showed signs of catastrophic erosion. A massive water event had torn through here, reshaping the landscape. As he moved laterally along the wall, more evidence emerged. Fragments of asphalt, another section of guardrail, and then caught in a crevice, something that made his breath catch, a mud-caked metal sign. Mark carefully extracted it, wiping away years of sediment. The text became visible. "Restricted area, authorized personnel only, ARF Facility 2 MI. His hands trembled as he secured the sign to his belt. This was it. Confirmation of a secret access road leading directly to the Alpine Research Facility. A road that had been completely erased by the storm. Mark climbed back up to the team, displaying his discovery. The bus didn't get lost. It was on a road that no longer exists, a restricted access route to the facility. Elena examined the sign. So the storm didn't just happen to hit while the bus was passing through. It completely destroyed their route, washing it away and creating this ravine. Or that was the intention, David said quietly. The implication hung heavily in the rain-soaked air. What if the storm hadn't been a natural event? What if its purpose had been to erase evidence? Mark stared down into the churning waters. "We need to follow this ravine. It's following the path of the old road." They traversed the treacherous edge, documenting more evidence as they went. Additional guardrail fragments, asphalt chunks, even a twisted mile marker. The ravine gradually widened, the waters below growing more turbulent. Then Pamela spotted it, a massive shape jutting from the opposite wall of the ravine, half buried in rock and sediment. Yellow paint peeked through the mud covering it. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's the front end of the bus." Embedded in the ravine wall 30 feet below them was the crushed remains of Bus 37's cab, the hood crumpled like paper, the windshield gone. Water surged around it, threatening to dislodge it with each powerful surge. They stood in stunned silence, finally face to face with the vehicle that had disappeared with their children 3 years ago. But rather than answers, its discovery only deepened the mystery. The bus hadn't simply vanished. It had been swallowed by a cataclysm that erased an entire road from existence, and someone had wanted it that way. The discovery of the bus's front section galvanized the team into action. Despite the continuing drizzle and fading daylight, they established a precarious base camp on a small ledge opposite the wreckage. David quickly deployed a portable winch system anchored to several sturdy trees, while Elena prepared the documentation equipment. "We need to reach it before dark," Mark said, strapping on a climbing harness. "That water level could rise overnight." James double-checked the safety rigging. "I'll go first. I have the most technical climbing experience." No one argued. James descended on the primary line, while Mark followed on a parallel safety rope. The ravine walls were treacherous, slick with rain and loose debris. Twice, James narrowly avoided small rock slides triggered by his movement. Reaching the crushed bus cab was like confronting a ghost. The iconic yellow paint, though mud-caked and faded, remained instantly recognizable. The front windshield was completely gone, the metal frame twisted inward like a gaping mouth. The hood had accordioned backward, crushing the driver's compartment. "No one could have survived this impact," James said quietly, securing his position on a narrow outcropping beside the wreckage. Mark joined him, breathing heavily from the descent. "Let's not make assumptions. We document everything." They began methodically photographing the wreckage from every possible angle. Elena monitored from above, directing their documentation via radio. The cab was partially embedded in the ravine wall, suggesting it had been carried by the floodwaters, before being pinned against the rock face as the waters carved deeper into the mountainside. "The driver's seat is empty," Mark noted, aiming his flashlight through the shattered front. "No sign of Frank Larson." "Check for identification numbers," David instructed over the radio. "We need to confirm it's definitely Bus 37. James carefully brushed away sediment from the crumpled fender, revealing the district's identification code. "It's confirmed. This is the bus." Mark leaned further in, examining the crushed dashboard. The radio equipment was destroyed, but surprisingly, the ignition area remained somewhat intact. The key was still in position, turned to on. "Frank had the bus running when whatever happened," Mark reported. "And look at this. The door control is set to open." As the light shifted, something gleamed beneath the mud coating the passenger side floor. Mark reached carefully through the shattered windshield frame, his fingers closing around a metal object. "I've got something." He extracted his hand, revealing a dented metal name badge. Wiping it clean, he read the text aloud. "Marion Reeves, Science Department." "The teacher," James confirmed. Mark bagged the evidence, then continued his examination. "The rest of the bus is missing. This is just the cab section, maybe 5 feet of the front end." "Could have been sheared off in the flood," James suggested. "Maybe," Mark said, unconvinced. His flashlight beam caught something odd in the torn metal at the separation point. "Look at this edge." James leaned closer. "Those aren't tear marks. That's a clean cut." The metal where the cab separated from the rest of the bus showed clear evidence of precision cutting, the kind made by industrial tools, not chaotic flood damage. "Someone cut this bus apart," Mark whispered, the implications chilling him more than the rain seeping through his gear. A warning call came from above. "Lights fading fast," David reported. "We need to get you up before it's too dark." They collected final samples, metal fragments, soil from inside the cab, a small piece of the seat fabric, before beginning their ascent. The climb back was more difficult, the ropes now slick with rain and darkness descending rapidly. At camp, that night, they huddled under a makeshift tarp shelter examining their findings. Elena studied the metal edge samples under a portable microscope. "These are definitely tool marks," she confirmed, "consistent with a plasma cutter or similar high-temperature cutting device. So the bus crashes, and someone comes along and methodically cuts away the passenger section?" Pamela asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "Or," Mark said slowly, "the bus was stopped, the students were removed, then it was deliberately destroyed and scattered to simulate an accident." The group fell silent, processing the horror of this possibility. "But why?" David finally asked. "Why take 30 children?" Mark stared into the darkness toward the distant lights they'd spotted earlier, the presumed location of the Alpine research facility. "Tomorrow we find out," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "The facility is less than 5 miles from here. Whatever happened to those kids, the answers are there." As if in response, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the rain intensified, drumming against their shelter. None of them slept much that night, haunted by the image of the yellow metal cab, deliberately severed from the rest of the bus and from the children who had been inside it. Morning brought clearer skies, but deeper concerns. As the team packed, their gear, preparing to continue toward the Alpine research facility, Mark noticed Elena examining something she'd retrieved from the bus cab during their second examination at dawn. "What is it?" he asked, approaching her makeshift workstation. She held up a waterlogged bundle wrapped in plastic. "Found it wedged under the driver's seat. Didn't notice it yesterday in the fading light." Carefully, she unwrapped the plastic, revealing a sodden notebook. Despite its protective covering, water had seeped in over the years, leaving the pages swollen and fragile. With gloved hands, Eleanor gently separated the first page. "It's a journal," she said, squinting at the bleeding ink. "Belongs to someone named Zoe Bennett." Pamela gasped softly. Zoe was on the bus. Sophomore. Honor student. Mark leaned closer as Elena carefully turned to the next page, using a soft brush to separate the delicate paper. The handwriting was neat but hurried, some entries smudged beyond recognition. Others remained legible. "This entry is dated the day of the disappearance," Elena said. "Mrs. Reeves seems nervous about something. Driver took a weird turn off the main road, said there's flooding ahead. But the sky was clear 10 minutes ago." Bim. The team exchanged glances as Elena continued reading fragments. "Storm came out of nowhere. Never seen anything like it. Bus is stuck now. Driver's on the radio, but won't tell us who he's talking to." Elena turned another page with painstaking care. "They're here. Men in dark uniforms. No markings. Driver says we need to evacuate the bus. Something about unsafe conditions." Mark's pulse quickened. This was the first eyewitness account of what had actually happened, confirmation that the disappearance wasn't a random accident. The next several pages were too damaged to read clearly, just fragments of words and incomplete sentences. But as Elena reached the final third of the journal, the entries became legible again, dated 3 days after the disappearance. "They separated us into groups. No explanation. Haven't seen Mrs. Reeves since yesterday. They took her somewhere else. We're in some kind of underground place. Concrete walls, no windows. David was already documenting each page with his camera. This proves they survived the initial incident. "And were taken somewhere," Mark added, his voice tight. The next entry sent a chill through the group. "Tyler tried to run during the move to the new section. They used some kind of weapon on him. Not a gun, no sound. He just dropped. They carried him away, said he was being taken to special observation. Haven't seen him since." James turned away, his son's name hitting him like a physical blow. Elena continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "They're doing tests on us, blood draws every morning. Some kind of scan in the afternoon. They won't tell us why or what they're looking for. Just keep saying we're helping important research." Jessica got sick after yesterday's procedure. High fever. They took her to another section. The final legible entry was dated nearly 2 weeks after the disappearance. "I'm hiding this journal in my clothes. Going to try to get it back to the bus next time they move us. If anyone finds this, 30 kids from Pinecrest are being held at a place they call ARF. Underground levels, medical experiments, some kind of radiation testing." There, the entry ended abruptly. The remaining pages water-damaged beyond recovery. Silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. The children hadn't died in a bus accident. They'd been taken, abducted for some kind of testing program at the very facility they were now approaching. "We need to document this properly," Mark finally said, his voice strained. "Then we need to reach the facility today." "If what Zoe wrote is true," Pamela said slowly, "they could still be alive. 3 years later, they could still be there." Mark met her gaze, seeing his own desperate hope reflected. "That's why we keep going." Elena carefully rewrapped the sheet journal, storing it in a waterproof evidence container. There will be security at the facility if they went to these lengths to hide what they were doing. "We'll deal with that when we get there," Mark said firmly. "Those are our children. And now we have proof they were taken." As they shouldered their packs and began the final trek toward the Alpine Research Facility, the journal's revelations fueled a new sense of urgency. This was no longer just a search for answers. It was a rescue mission. And the clock had been ticking for 3 long years. The Alpine Research Facility looked abandoned at first glance, a cluster of weathered concrete buildings surrounded by rusted chain-link fencing overtaken by vegetation. No lights, no movement, no signs of occupation. The team observed from a ridgeline overlooking the complex, using binoculars to scout potential entry points. "This place should be crawling with security if they're holding 30 kids," James whispered. "But I'm not seeing anyone." Mark studied the layout. "Maybe they're not using the surface buildings. Zoe's journal mentioned underground levels." They watched for another hour, documenting the facility from their vantage point. No vehicles came or went, no guards patrolled the perimeter. The place appeared deserted. "We go in after dark," Mark decided. "Elena stays here as our contact point." The anthropologist nodded, accepting her role as the team's lifeline to the outside world. If something went wrong, she would be their only hope of getting help. Dusk stretched into evening and finally into night. Under cover of darkness, Mark led the group down to the facility's perimeter fence. A quick inspection revealed a section where erosion had created a gap beneath the chain link. Not large, but enough to squeeze through with effort. "Security cameras?" Pamela whispered, scanning the buildings. "None that I can see," David replied. "If they're there, they're well hidden." They slipped beneath the fence one by one, then crouched in the shadows listening. Nothing but the wind and distant owl calls broke the silence. The main administrative building stood before them, its windows dark and empty. The front entrance was locked, but a side door yielded to David's lockpicking skills, a talent he'd developed during their years of searching. They entered cautiously, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Inside was exactly what one would expect from an abandoned research facility. Dusty desks, empty filing cabinets, outdated computer equipment. Everything of value or importance had been removed long ago. "This doesn't make sense," James muttered. "There's nothing here." Mark moved to a central hallway, where a large blueprint of the facility hung on the wall. "Look at this," he said, shining his light on the faded document. 5 underground levels, accessible through a central elevator shaft. They followed the hallway to where the elevator should be, finding instead a service stairwell with a heavy security door. It was locked, but unlike the exterior doors, this one featured a modern keypad access system, new technology in an otherwise abandoned facility. "This is active," David confirmed, examining the keypad, "and recently used." While David worked on bypassing the security system, Mark explored a nearby maintenance room. Behind stacks of forgotten supplies, he discovered a ventilation schematic showing the airflow design for the underground levels. "These are currently operational," he said, bringing the document to the others. "Look at the dates on these maintenance logs, entries from last month." "Got it," David announced as the security door clicked open. "We're in." They descended the concrete stairwell cautiously, the air growing noticeably cooler and more sterile with each level they passed. At the bottom, another security door awaited them, this one already slightly ajar. Beyond it stretched a long corridor with polished floors and fluorescent lighting that automatically activated as they entered. Motion sensors still functioning. The pristine condition stood in stark contrast to the decaying surface buildings. "This is active," Pamela whispered. "Someone's maintaining this." They moved through the corridor, passing laboratories with observation windows revealing sophisticated equipment, centrifuges, medical monitoring stations, and other devices they couldn't identify. All appeared well-maintained and ready for use, though currently idle. A sign on one door read, "Subject Processing." David pushed it open carefully, revealing a room with 30 empty beds arranged in rows. On a whiteboard, faded but still legible, was a list of names, the roster from Bus 37. They were here, Mark breathed, all of them. But the room held no personal effects, no signs of current occupation. It appeared unused for some time, though meticulously preserved. At the far end of the corridor, they discovered something unexpected, a massive circular door resembling a bank vault, standing partially open. Beyond it lay darkness and the distinct sound of flowing water. "This wasn't on the facility blueprints," James noted. Mark shined his light through the opening, revealing a rough-hewn tunnel extending into darkness. Unlike the clinical environment of the research facility, this passage appeared to be a natural cave system, expanded and reinforced with structural supports. This facility wasn't built here by accident, Mark realized. It was built to access whatever's down there. As they stared into the darkness beyond the vault door, the implications were clear. The underground levels weren't just laboratories. They were an entrance to something else entirely, something hidden deep within the mountain itself. "The children," Pamela said softly, "if they're still alive." "They're down there," Mark finished, his light beam seeming to disappear into the infinite darkness of the tunnel, "and we're going to find them." The tunnel beyond the vault door stretched into darkness, its walls a mixture of natural stone and reinforced concrete. The team moved cautiously, their flashlight beams revealing tracks embedded in the floor, a small rail system designed for transport carts. The air grew damper, the sound of flowing water more pronounced with each step. "This tunnel runs directly into the mountain," David observed, consulting his GPS unit. "Signals weakening, but I estimate we're heading northwest." Mark led the way, his mind racing with possibilities. If the missing students had been moved through here, where had they been taken, and why? They'd progressed perhaps a quarter mile when James suddenly raised his hand for silence. "Listen." Everyone froze, straining to hear beyond the dripping water. At first, nothing. Then a faint metallic scraping, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone or something was moving ahead of them. "Kill the lights," Mark whispered. In the sudden darkness, the sound became clearer, the unmistakable cadence of footsteps now quickening. They weren't alone in the tunnel. Mark switched his light back on, pointing it ahead just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure disappearing around a bend. "Hey!" he called out, breaking into a run. The team pursued, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The tunnel widened into a junction where 3 separate passages branched outward. The figure was nowhere to be seen. "Which way?" Pamela gasped, trying to catch her breath. James knelt, examining the damp ground. Footprints, recent, leading into the rightmost tunnel. They followed the trail, moving more cautiously now. The passage sloped downward, taking them deeper into the mountain. The rail tracks continued, supplemented now by thick cables running along the ceiling, power lines, and what appeared to be data conduits. The tunnel ended abruptly at a steel door. Unlike the high-tech security systems above, this featured a simple mechanical lock. James examined it closely. "It's been used recently, no dust in the mechanism." David made quick work of the lock. The door opened with a protesting creak, revealing a small chamber that appeared to be a monitoring station. Banks of screens lined one wall, though they were currently dark. A desk held an assortment of equipment, radios, logbooks, and what looked like surveillance gear. "Someone's been watching the facility," Mark said, examining a logbook. The final entry was dated just 3 days earlier, a simple notation, shift change, no activity on levels 1-5. Pamela opened a locker against the far wall and gasped. Inside hung uniforms, not military but something resembling maintenance coveralls. Patches on the shoulders bore the now familiar ARF logo. "These aren't government issue," she said. "They look like private contractor gear." James discovered a cache of supplies in another cabinet, packaged food, water bottles, medical kits. Someone's been stationed here long-term, watching and waiting. Mark turned his attention to a file box labeled Incident Reports. Inside were dozens of handwritten logs, many featuring the same neat script. He pulled one at random, dated approximately 1 year after the bus disappearance. "Subject 17 attempted escape via North Tunnel," he read aloud. "Retrieved and returned to containment. Heightened security measures implemented in sectors B through D." The implications sent a chill through the group. These weren't records. From 3 years ago, they were ongoing reports. Someone had been monitoring captives all this time. "Look at this," David called from the corner, where he discovered a small generator connected to a switch panel. "This powers something downstream." Before they could investigate further, a new sound penetrated the chamber. Voices, distant but approaching. Multiple people moving with purpose. "We need to hide," Mark whispered urgently. They quickly extinguished their lights and concealed themselves behind equipment and inside storage closets. Moments later, the door creaked open again. Flashlight. Beams swept the room as 2 figures entered. Through a crack in the closet door, Mark could make out men wearing the uniforms they'd just discovered. Maintenance workers or security personnel. "Someone's been here," one man said, examining the disturbed logbook. "Alert command. We may have intruders." The second man raised a radio to his lips. "Control, this is Outpost 3. Possible security breach. Requesting backup and initiating containment protocol." A woman's voice crackled through the radio. "Understood. Security teams dispatched. Find them before they reach the subjects." As the men exited, moving further down the tunnel system, the team exchanged silent glances in the darkness. Their worst fears and greatest hopes were simultaneously confirmed. The students were still here, still alive, and the people who had taken them would do anything to keep their secret buried. The team remained hidden for nearly 20 minutes, listening as security personnel moved through nearby tunnels. Radio chatter indicated a systematic search expanding outward from the monitoring station. Mark's mind raced, calculating their dwindling options. They were deep underground, with unknown forces mobilizing against them, and somewhere ahead were the missing children, possibly including his daughter. "We need to move deeper," he whispered, once the immediate area fell silent. "They're searching outward, expecting us to flee toward the exit." James nodded grimly. "Toward the subjects they mentioned." They slipped from their hiding places and gathered around a schematic David had discovered pinned beneath the desk, a crude map of the tunnel system. Unlike the polished blueprints of the research facility above, this appeared hand-drawn, with sections marked restricted and containment areas. "This system is massive," David murmured. "Miles of tunnels." A notation at the bottom caught Mark's attention. "Property of U.S. Department of Energy, Project Helios." This isn't just some private research facility, he realized. This is a black government site. The revelation sparked grim understanding. The Department of Energy controlled America's nuclear research, among other sensitive projects. Whatever had happened to the children, it involved classified government operations, explaining the extraordinary efforts to conceal their disappearance. "We follow this tunnel," Mark decided, indicating a passage marked Main Access, B level. "It leads to what looks like a central hub." Moving with heightened caution, they navigated the dimly lit passageways, using the schematic as their guide. Twice they ducked into alcoves as security teams passed nearby. The radio David had taken from the monitoring station provided sporadic intelligence on the search patterns. After nearly an hour of tense progress, the tunnel widened dramatically, opening into what could only be described as an underground hangar. The space was cavernous, at least 50 yards across, with a domed ceiling reinforced by massive steel supports. Industrial lighting cast harsh shadows across concrete floors, polished smooth by years of use. Most shocking was what occupied the center of the space, a cluster of prefabricated buildings, like a small, self-contained complex built within the mountain itself. Signs identified different structures: medical, observation, analysis, and containment. "It's an entire research facility," Pamela whispered, "hidden inside the mountain." "Look!" James pointed to a large radiation warning symbol affixed to one building. "Whatever they're doing involves radioactive materials." Mark's gaze was drawn to the far side of the hangar, where a massive blast door stood sealed. Above it, illuminated in red lettering, "Helios Chamber, authorized personnel only." They crept along the perimeter, using equipment crates for cover. Through windows in the observation building, they could see monitors displaying data streams and what appeared to be medical readouts, heart rates, brain activity, radiation levels. David accessed a computer terminal outside the medical building, his tech expertise bypassing the basic security. "These are patient files," he said, scanning through directories. 30 files, labeled Subject 1 through 30. "The students," Pamela confirmed, her voice breaking. Mark peered over David's shoulder as he opened one file at random. Clinical language described ongoing exposure tolerance and cellular adaptation rates. Photos showed brain scans with anomalous patterns highlighted. "What have they done to them?" Mark whispered. Before David could access more files, alarms suddenly blared throughout the complex. Red warning lights began to flash across the hangar. "Attention all personnel," a computerized voice announced. "Containment breach detected in Sector C. This is not a drill. Initiate Protocol Omega." Security doors began closing automatically throughout the complex. Personnel emerged from buildings, moving with practiced urgency toward predetermined stations. "They found us," James said. "No," David replied, pointing to a security monitor displaying a sealed chamber where something was happening. The camera view was partially obscured, but they could see figures in hazmat suits responding to what appeared to be a containment failure. "Something else is happening." A new voice cut through the alarm, this one human and urgent. "All security teams to containment immediately. Subject 28 is attempting to breach the Helios chamber. Stop them at all costs." Mark's heart nearly stopped. Subject 28. He had memorized the bus manifest years ago, knew every name, every seat assignment. Subject 28 was Emily Reynolds. His daughter was alive, and somehow she was fighting back. The facility had erupted into controlled chaos. Security personnel rushed toward the Helios chamber while scientists hurriedly secured data and equipment. In the confusion, the search team managed to slip into the now empty medical building, seeking both shelter and answers. "We need to find Emily," Mark insisted, his voice tight with desperate urgency. "First, we need to understand what's happening," James countered. "Otherwise, we're running blind." David was already at a computer terminal, fingers flying across the keyboard. Systems in emergency mode. Security protocols relaxed for evacuation procedures. A door at the rear of the laboratory suddenly opened. The team froze as a figure entered, a woman in a lab coat, her hair streaked with premature grey. She stopped abruptly, eyes widening at the sight of the intruders. "Who are—" she began, then recognition dawned on her face as she looked at Mark. "You're her father, Emily's father." Mark stepped forward, tension radiating from every muscle. "Where is my daughter?" The woman glanced nervously at the security monitors. "There's no time. They'll seal the entire sector soon. You shouldn't be here." "Neither should 30 children who were kidnapped 3 years ago," Pamela shot back. Something in the woman's expression shifted, a mixture of shame and resolution. "My name is Dr. Abigail Ward. I've been working with the subjects since they arrived." "They're not subjects," Mark snapped. "They're children." Dr. Ward moved to a cabinet, retrieving a small drive which she pressed into David's hand. "Everything's on here. Everything they did. Everything I helped them do. God, forgive me." "What is Project Helios?" James demanded. "A radiation experiment that should never have happened," she replied, checking the security monitors again. "The Department of Energy discovered something in these mountains decades ago, an unusual radiation signature unlike anything we'd seen before. They built this facility to study it." "And the children?" Pamela pressed. "They needed subjects with developing neural pathways. Adult brains couldn't adapt to the exposure patterns." Her voice cracked slightly. "When early animal testing showed remarkable cognitive enhancements from controlled exposure, the project director authorized human trials." Mark felt physically ill. "You experimented on children." "I didn't authorize it," she insisted. "I was brought in afterward, told they were orphans, volunteers. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. The changes had already begun." "Changes?" James echoed. Dr. Ward hesitated. "The radiation affects developing brains in unprecedented ways. Enhanced cognitive abilities, certainly, but also other effects. Shared consciousness, remote viewing capabilities. As they matured, some developed abilities we couldn't even measure." David looked up from the computer. "You're saying the radiation gave them psychic abilities?" "We don't use that term, but yes, essentially," she admitted. "Emily is the strongest. She began manifesting abilities beyond anything we anticipated. She can influence systems, electronic equipment, and others." Mark's mind reeled. "She's my daughter. I'm taking her home." "You don't understand," Dr. Ward said urgently. "What's happening now? Emily initiated it. For 3 years, they've been conditioning these children, training them to harness the radiation effects, but they underestimated her. She's not trying to escape. She's trying to reach the source." The facility's intercom crackled to life. Containment breach escalating. Helios chamber outer locks compromised. All personnel evacuate immediately. Fear flashed across Dr. Ward's face. The Helios chamber contains the radiation source. If she fully exposes herself to it... She left the sentence unfinished. "Take us to her, now!" Mark demanded. Dr. Ward hesitated, then nodded. "I've been feeding her information for months, preparing her. I didn't know she would act so soon." "You've been helping her?" Pamela asked. "Someone had to stop this," Dr. Ward replied. "These children, what's been done to them? It's unconscionable, but Emily's plan is dangerous if she absorbs too much radiation at once." Mark cut her off. "Just take us to my daughter." She led them to a service corridor connecting the buildings. "The subjects are kept in containment, but Emily won't be there now. She'll be at the chamber." As they moved through the passage, the facility's emergency systems intensified, lights flickering, alarms changing tone. "She's affecting the systems," Dr. Ward explained, "disrupting the security protocols." Mark pressed forward, driven by a father's determination. 3 years of searching, of refusing to give up hope when everyone else had moved on. 3 years of knowing somehow that his daughter was still alive. He was close now. Nothing would stop him from reaching her. Not security forces, not government secrets, not even the mysterious radiation that had transformed his daughter into something the scientists themselves feared. "Hold on, Emily," he whispered. "Dad's coming." The service corridor ended at a security door with a biometric scanner. Dr. Ward pressed her palm against it, but the system flashed red, denying access. "Emily's locked down the standard protocols," she explained. "She's isolating the containment sector." David examined the panel. "Can we bypass it?" Before Dr. Ward could answer, the light on the scanner suddenly turned green. The door clicked, open on its own. "She knows we're here," Dr. Ward whispered. "She's helping us." They entered a long hallway with observation windows along one side, revealing a communal living space beyond. Inside were teenagers, perhaps 20 of them, sitting in perfect stillness. Despite the facility's blaring alarms and flashing lights, none of them moved or reacted. They simply sat, eyes open but vacant, as if their minds were elsewhere. "The children from bus 37, Pamela gasped, pressing her hand against the glass. "Some of them," Dr. Ward confirmed. "The ones who survived the initial adaptation process." Mark scanned the room desperately. "Emily's not here." "No, she's one of the Phase 2 subjects. They're housed separately." James was staring at 2 boys seated side by side, identical twins with hollow cheeks and shaved heads. "My sons," he choked out. "Tyler and Travis." Unlike the others, the twins turned simultaneously at the sound of their father's voice, their eyes focusing on him through the glass. A look of recognition passed over their gaunt faces. "Why aren't they responding to the alarms?" David asked. "Because they're not really here," Dr. Ward explained. "Not mentally. Emily has linked with them. They're helping her access the Helios chamber." Pamela spotted her daughter Rebecca among the seated teenagers. "What have you done to them?" she demanded, rounding on Dr. Ward. "The radiation exposure altered their neural pathways, created connections between them. They developed a form of collective consciousness. Emily discovered she could coordinate them, link their abilities." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying she's controlling them?" "Not controlling, connecting, like a conductor leading an orchestra. Each maintains individuality, but together they can achieve things impossible for a single mind." Dr. Ward checked a monitor on the wall. "And right now, they're focused on the Helios chamber." The door at the far end of the hallway suddenly opened, 3 teenagers emerged, 2 boys and a girl. Unlike the others, they moved with purpose, approaching the observation window where James stood watching his sons. Phase 2 subjects, Dr. Ward explained. Advanced cases with specialized abilities. The girl, perhaps 16 with close-cropped dark hair, approached the glass, separating them from the seated children. She placed her palm against it and closed her eyes. Immediately, the glass began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched tone. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface before it shattered completely, falling away in glittering shards. Hannah can manipulate molecular structures, Dr. Ward said. The boys have their own specialties. The seated teenagers began to rise in unison, moving with synchronized precision toward the now open window frame. Their expressions remained vacant, as if they were sleepwalking. They're following Emily's direction, Dr. Ward explained. She's gathering them. James rushed forward as his sons stepped through the broken window, embracing them tightly. The twins returned the hug mechanically, their movements stiff and uncertain, as if they'd forgotten the gesture. "Dad," one of them whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. "Emily says hurry." Mark approached the Phase 2 girl. "Hannah, where is Emily?" The girl turned to him, her gaze penetrating and somehow older than her years. "Completing the circuit. We need to join her." "What does that mean?" Mark pressed. "The source requires all of us to stabilize it," she replied cryptically. "Emily opened the way, but she can't hold it alone." The facility shuddered, the lights flickering more violently. An automated voice announced, "Critical system failure imminent. Helios containment at 20% and falling." "We need to move," Dr. Ward urged. "If the containment fails completely, the radiation will flood this entire level." Hannah turned toward a corridor leading deeper into the facility. "This way, Emily is waiting." The surviving students, 27, of the original 30, fell into formation behind Hannah and the other Phase 2 subjects. They moved as one unit, navigating the facility with uncanny precision, responding to obstacles before they appeared. Mark walked alongside Hannah, desperate for answers. What happened to the other 3 children? The adaptation was too much. "And for them," she replied without emotion, "their bodies rejected the changes. And Marion Reeves, the teacher, she became like us, then she became more. She's with the source now." The implications of Hannah's words chilled Mark to the bone. Whatever waited for them in the Helios chamber, it had already claimed lives, and now his daughter, his Emily, stood at its threshold. As the group moved through the disintegrating facility, Mark steeled himself for what lay ahead. After 3 years of searching, he'd found the survivors, but the true horror of what had been done to them, what they had become, was only beginning to emerge. The procession of survivors led Mark and the search team through the deteriorating facility, navigating with eerie precision as systems failed around them. Emergency bulkheads sealed and unsealed as they approached, as if the facility itself was cooperating with their advance. Hannah walked at the front, occasionally tilting her head as though listening to instructions only she could hear. "Emily is maintaining the path," Dr. Ward explained, her voice hushed with something between fear and awe. "She's manipulating the security systems, creating a corridor for us." They descended deeper into the mountain through a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever. The air grew noticeably warmer, tinged with an electrical scent that made the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. "The Helios chamber is housed at the lowest level," Dr. Ward continued, "built directly around the radiation source. It's not of terrestrial origin." "What does that mean?" James demanded, his arms still protectively around his twin sons, who moved with the same vacant, coordinated precision as the others. "The Department of Energy discovered it 20 years ago. a meteorite fragment embedded deep in the mountain, emitting unique radiation patterns. They built this facility to study it in secret. Mark struggled to process this information, and they exposed children to alien radiation deliberately. Adult subjects showed minimal effects, but developing brains, children's brains, exhibited remarkable adaptation. The ethical concerns were overridden. The stairwell ended at a massive circular door resembling a bank vault. Unlike the sleek modern technology of the upper levels, this barrier looked almost archaic. Thick steel with manual locking, wheels and heavy bolts. Warning signs in multiple languages covered its surface. The door was partially open. Hannah paused before the gap, turning to address the group for the first time. Emily has weakened the containment field. We must move quickly to stabilize the source. What happens if it's not stabilized? Pamela asked, clutching her daughter's unresponsive hand. Catastrophic radiation release, Dr. Ward answered. These mountains, everything within a 100-mile radius. It would be uninhabitable for centuries. Hannah stepped through the doorway, the other children following in perfect synchronization. Mark and the search team exchanged glances, then proceeded after them, each understanding that turning back was no longer an option. Beyond the vault door stretched a cavernous chamber carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. The walls were lined with complex equipment, radiation sensors, monitoring stations, and what appeared to be containment generators. Most were damaged, sparking and failing as power fluctuated throughout the facility. At the chamber's center stood a raised platform surrounded by a ring of what looked like modified particle accelerators. Above the platform floated something that defied explanation. A jagged crystalline object approximately the size of a car, glowing with shifting colors that seemed to exist somewhere between ultraviolet and infrared, occasionally bleeding into visible spectrum in pulses of blue-green luminescence. And before it, arms outstretched toward the impossible object, stood Emily Reynolds. 3 years had transformed Mark's daughter from a 12-year-old child into a teenager on the cusp of adulthood. Her hair, once long and brown, had been shorn close to her scalp. Her frame was thin, almost fragile, yet she stood with absolute stillness. Her body arched as if electricity was coursing through her. "Emily!" Mark called out, his voice breaking. She didn't turn, but her voice somehow filled the chamber, though her lips didn't move. "Dad, you found us." The other children moved into position around the platform, forming concentric circles, each taking specific places as if following a predetermined pattern. "What are you doing, Emily?" Mark pleaded, stepping closer despite Dr. Ward's warning gesture. "Completing what they started, but not for them, for us." The floating crystal pulsed more intensely, its light now visibly connecting to Emily through tendrils of luminescence. Similar tendrils began extending toward the other children as they took their positions. "The containment system is failing," Dr. Ward explained urgently. "But the children, they've evolved to channel the radiation. They're becoming living containment vessels." Mark watched in horror as the light from the crystal fragment touched each child in succession, their eyes illuminating with the same unearthly glow. "Emily, stop!" he shouted. "Come away from there." "I can't, Dad." Emily's voice resonated in their minds. "The descent has already begun. We're becoming something new." The chamber shuddered as the crystal pulsed more violently, its otherworldly light growing to envelop the entire platform. "What's happening?" James demanded. Dr. Ward's face had gone pale. "They're not just containing it. They're merging with it. God help us, they're evolving." The crystal's light intensified until Mark had to shield his eyes. When the brilliance finally subsided, the chamber had transformed. The mechanical containment systems lay dormant, their purpose now obsolete. In their place, a network of luminescent filaments spread across the walls and ceiling, pulsing with the same otherworldly glow as the meteorite fragment. Emily stood at the center, no longer reaching toward the crystal, but seemingly at peace. The fragment now hovered closer to her, rotating slowly as if in communion. The other children had formed a precise geometric pattern around her, each connected to the others by threads of light. "What have you done?" Dr. Ward whispered, awe and terror mingling in her voice. Emily turned, her eyes now pools of shifting blue-green light. When she spoke, her voice was both her own and something more, layered with harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the mind. "We've stabilized it, created a symbiosis. The radiation no longer leaks destructively. We channel it, direct it." Mark took a tentative step forward. "Emily, are you still you?" A smile flickered across his daughter's face, a glimpse of the child he remembered. "I'm more me than I've ever been, Dad, and I'm part of something greater now." Hannah approached Mark and the others, her movements more fluid than before. "For 3 years, they tried to weaponize us and the Source. They didn't understand what was happening. The Source isn't a weapon. It's a seed." "A seed for what?" James asked, still protectively near his sons. "A colony," Emily answered. "A new way of existing. The beginning of the next evolution of consciousness." As if responding to her words, the chamber walls seemed to pulse. Mark noticed for the first time that the rock itself had changed, becoming more crystalline, faceted surfaces reflecting the strange light. "The Source has been reaching out for millennia," Emily continued, "searching for compatible vessels. When they exposed us to its radiation, they accidentally initiated the process it was designed for, symbiotic integration with developing minds." Dr. Ward stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "You've been changing the facility, the tunnels, the structure." "We've been preparing," Hannah confirmed, "creating a suitable environment. The mountain itself is becoming our home, our colony." Mark struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. "But you're still children. Our children." Emily approached him, stopping just beyond arm's reach. The luminescence in her eyes dimmed slightly, revealing more of the daughter he remembered. "We remember our families, our homes, but we can't go back to being what we were," she said gently. "The changes are irreversible and necessary." "Necessary for what?" Pamela asked, her voice breaking as she looked at her own daughter, now standing perfectly still within the geometric formation. "Protection," Emily replied simply. "What's coming needs to be met with understanding, not fear. We're the interface, the bridge." The implications of her words hung in the air. Mark felt a chill despite the chamber's warmth. "Something else is coming?" "The Source is a beacon," Hannah explained, "a preparation. Others will follow, seeking communion, not conquest. Humanity needs intermediaries who understand both sides." Dr. Ward's scientific mind was racing. "You're saying the meteorite is some kind of advanced technology? Preparing Earth for contact?" "Not technology as you understand it," Emily corrected. "Something that exists between matter and energy, consciousness and form. We're becoming like it, neither fully human nor fully other." Mark couldn't hold back any longer. He crossed the distance between them and embraced his daughter. Though her body felt different, slightly warmer, humming with subtle energy, her arms wrapped around him in the familiar way that broke his heart. "I've missed you so much," he whispered. "I know, Dad. I felt you searching. Your determination helped me stay connected to my humanity while I changed." The facility shuddered again, more violently this time. The lights in the upper levels flickered visible through the spiral staircase. "They're coming," Emily said, pulling back from the embrace. Government forces. They've detected the containment failure and are initiating scorched earth protocols. They'll try to bury this whole mountain, Dr. Ward realized. Nuclear option. Emily nodded gravely. We're not ready yet. The colony needs more time to establish itself, to become self-sustaining. She looked at Mark, then at the other parents, who had searched for so long. In her luminescent eyes was both determination and a request. We need your help, she said, to protect what we're becoming, to help the world understand when the time comes. Mark looked at his daughter, different, yet still recognizably Emily, and at the impossible colony forming around her. After 3 years of searching, he'd found not just survivors, but pioneers of something beyond human comprehension. Tell us what to do, he said. The chamber trembled as distant explosions echoed through the mountain. The government's containment team had begun their approach, methodically sealing tunnels and access points as they descended toward the Helios chamber. They'll reach us in 20 minutes, David reported, monitoring the facility's security feeds on a terminal that still functioned. Emily stood with the search team, explaining rapidly what needed to be done. The colony isn't fully established. We need more time to complete the transformation and anchor the source to this location. What exactly is this transformation? Mark asked, still struggling to comprehend what his daughter had become. In answer, Emily led them deeper into the chamber, past the central platform to a section that had been completely reshaped. The mountain rock had crystallized into structures resembling organic architecture, flowing forms that seemed both grown and constructed. Within these structures moved the former teacher, Marion Reeves, or what had once been Marion Reeves. Her form was only vaguely human now, elongated and partially translucent, her skin bearing the same crystalline quality as the walls. Filaments of light moved beneath her surface, and when she turned toward them, her eyes held the same luminescence as the children's, only more intense, more complete. Mrs. Reeves volunteered to undergo the complete transformation first, Emily explained. She's showing us the way. The transformed teacher didn't speak conventionally, but a sense of greeting and urgency nonetheless communicated itself directly to their minds. This is what you're all becoming? Pamela asked, horrified. And fascinated. Not exactly, Hannah explained. Each transformation is unique, based on individual neurology and purpose within the colony. Mrs. Reeves is a pathfinder. Her function is to extend the colony's structure. Dr. Ward approached cautiously, her scientific curiosity evident. The changes aren't just psychological or even physiological, they're fundamental, molecular restructuring. The radiation doesn't damage cells, it rewrites them, Emily confirmed. But the process takes time to stabilize. If they destroy this chamber now, the reaction will become uncontrolled. Everyone within 100 miles will be exposed. The implications were clear. Not just the death of everyone present, but catastrophic regional contamination. What do you need us to do? Mark asked. Emily's expression softened with gratitude. We need to redirect the military response. Dad, you and the others must go back up and make contact. Tell them what's happening here is containment, not threat. They won't believe us, James said. Show them this, Emily replied, placing her hand over the meteorite fragment. The crystal pulsed, and a portion of it separated, a small shard, that floated toward them. It hovered before Mark, gradually transforming into what looked like a data crystal, its glow muted but still present. This contains everything. The research data, records of what was done to us and proof of what we've become. Proof that we're containing the radiation, not weaponizing it. Another explosion, closer this time, shook dust from the ceiling. You need to go now, Emily urged. We'll continue the transformation by the time you return with the authorities. We'll have stabilized enough to demonstrate there's no threat. Mark clutched the crystal shard, torn between the need to help his daughter and the fear of leaving her again. What if they don't listen? What if they just seal this whole mountain? Anyway? Then the colony will adapt, Emily said with quiet confidence. But millions of innocent people will die from radiation exposure. We can't allow that. The parents exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. After 3 years of searching for their children, they now had to leave them again. This time, to save them. As they prepared to ascend, Emily approached her father one last time. She took his hand, and Mark gasped as a tingling sensation spread up his arm. For a brief moment, he experienced what his daughter had become, a consciousness both singular and collective, connected to something vast and ancient, yet newborn in this form. You'll understand when you return, she promised. The transformation isn't just happening to us, it's the beginning of something that will eventually touch all of humanity. She pressed her forehead to his, and in that contact, Mark glimpsed fragments of what awaited, not an invasion or replacement of humanity, but an evolution, a synthesis of human consciousness with something greater. Go, Emily whispered, pulling away. We'll be waiting. As Mark and the others hurried back toward the surface, guided by Dr. Ward through maintenance tunnels that would bypass the incoming forces, he clutched the crystal shard tight against his chest. 3 years ago, he had lost his daughter to forces he couldn't understand. Now he had found her transformed into something beyond understanding. But she was still Emily, and she needed him one more time. Behind them, the transformation of the colony continued, reshaping the heart of the mountain into something that was neither fully of Earth nor entirely alien. A new frontier of existence being born in the most unlikely of places, from the most innocent of beginnings. The maintenance tunnels Dr. Ward led them through were narrow and utilitarian, clearly designed as a last resort evacuation route. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow, making the ascent feel like a journey through arterial pathways of some vast organism. Mark clutched the crystal shard, which seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The brief connection he'd shared with Emily had left an impression, fragments of understanding beyond words, glimpses of what the colony was becoming. This route bypasses the main security checkpoints, Dr. Ward explained as they climbed. It should get us to the surface before the containment team reaches the chamber. Another explosion vibrated through the mountain, closer than the previous ones. They're using shape charges to seal the tunnels behind them, David observed. Grimly, standard protocol for containing a radiation leak. Eliminate all possible escape vectors. But they don't understand what they're dealing with, Pamela said. If they damage the chamber before the transformation is complete. James checked his watch. We've got maybe 15 minutes before they reach Emily and the others. The tunnel abruptly forked. Dr. Ward hesitated, consternation crossing her face. This isn't right. The schematics showed a direct route to the surface. They've modified the tunnel system, Mark realized, remembering how the facility had been gradually changing. The children have been reshaping the mountain. A distant mechanized rumbling caught their attention, heavy equipment moving through the main access shaft. Military's deploying something big, James said, straining to identify the sound. Sounds like a drill rig. They're going to bore straight down into the chamber. The crystal in Mark's hand suddenly pulsed brighter. Without understanding how, he knew which path to take. This way, he said with unexpected certainty, pointing. To the left fork. Emily's showing me. They followed Mark's lead, the crystal guiding them through a maze of passages that seemed to shift and reconfigure as they progressed. Twice they narrowly avoided security teams methodically sweeping the complex. They've got radiation suits and weapons, David reported after glimpsing one such team. They're not taking chances. The tunnel eventually opened into a natural cave system that hadn't been part of the original facility. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, their surfaces glittering with an unnatural luminescence, early signs of the transformation spreading through the mountain. "The colony is expanding," Dr. Ward observed, preparing alternative spaces. A final steep climb brought them to a narrow fissure. Cool air flowed through it, their first taste of the outside world in hours. One by one, they squeezed through the opening, emerging on a forested slope far from the facility's main entrance. In the valley below, they could see the military operation in full swing, helicopters circling, transport vehicles establishing a perimeter, hazmat-suited figures moving with tactical precision. A mobile command center had been established, its satellite dishes oriented toward the mountain. "We'll never get past that security cordon," James said, assessing the scene with his former rescue worker's eye. Mark stared at the crystal in his palm. "We don't need to. We just need to get their attention." He raised the shard toward the sky. As if responding to his intent, it flared brilliantly, sending a focused beam of light upward, a signal impossible to miss. The reaction was immediate. Shouts of alarm rose from the military camp. A helicopter veered in their direction, spotlight sweeping the hillside until it found them. "Federal agents, do not move!" Amplified voices commanded as the helicopter hovered above them. Mark stood his ground, holding the crystal shard higher. "We have information about what's happening inside the mountain. We know about Project Helios." Minutes later, they were surrounded by armed soldiers in radiation gear, weapons trained on them as a senior officer approached. His hazmat suit bore insignia indicating high rank within a specialized containment unit. "I'm Colonel Brenner, Department of Energy Containment Division," he announced through his suit's external speaker. "You're in a restricted area during an active containment operation." Mark stepped forward, ignoring the rifles that tracked his movement. "Your containment operation is going to cause the exact disaster you're trying to prevent. We've been inside. We've seen what's really happening." He held out the crystal shard. "This contains all the data on Project Helios, what they did to those children, and what's happening now. They're not a threat. They're containing the radiation source." Colonel Brenner stared at the glowing crystal, then at the determined faces of the search team. After a long moment, he raised his hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons. "You have 5 minutes to convince me not to bury that entire facility," he said. Mark clutched the crystal, feeling Emily's presence within it, her determination, her trust in him to protect the colony she was helping to create. "That's all we need," he replied. 3 weeks later, Mark Reynolds stood at the entrance to what had once been the Alpine Research Facility. The military presence had been reduced to a small observation team, their heavy equipment and containment gear replaced by scientific instruments and monitoring stations. A perimeter fence still surrounded the area, but it bore signs identifying it as an ecological research zone, rather than hazardous material warnings. Colonel Brenner approached, clipboard in hand. The past weeks had aged him visibly as he'd worked to redirect a military containment operation into a scientific monitoring mission. "The Oversight Committee just approved the final protocols. We're ready when you are." The crystal shard had provided irrefutable evidence of what had happened: the illegal abduction of the children, the unethical radiation experiments, and most importantly, the remarkable transformation that had followed. After initial skepticism, the highest levels of government had been forced to acknowledge that the situation inside the mountain was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Mark nodded toward the others waiting nearby: James, Pamela, David, and dozens of parents who had spent 3 years grieving children who weren't dead. They're ready too. The journey back into the mountain was different this time. The rough tunnels had been replaced by smooth passages with crystalline surfaces that emitted a soft, ambient light. The harsh military lighting and equipment had been carefully integrated with these new structures, creating a hybrid environment where human technology and the colony's architecture coexisted. As they descended, Mark noticed how the transformation had accelerated. What had been merely hints of crystallization 3 weeks ago now formed elaborate structures. The mountain hadn't just been hollowed out, it had been transformed into something new, neither building nor cave, but a living environment that seemed to respond to their presence. Dr. Abigail Ward, now leading the scientific team documenting the phenomenon, walked beside him. The radiation levels are completely stable. Whatever they've done with the source, it's contained more effectively than any technology we could have deployed. The group emerged into what had once been the Helios chamber. It had expanded dramatically, now a vast cathedral-like space with soaring crystalline arches and platforms connected by bridges of light. The meteorite fragment hovered at the center, larger than before, its pulsing glow synchronized with the architecture surrounding it. And there, waiting for them, were the children. They stood in their geometric formation, but their appearance had evolved further. Their bodies retained human form, but now possessed the same translucent quality Marion Reeves had exhibited. Light moved beneath their skin, and their eyes shimmered with the now familiar luminescence. They were neither fully human nor completely other, beautiful hybrids existing at the threshold of evolutionary change. Emily stepped forward from the group, moving with fluid grace. Her transformation was the most advanced among the children, her form almost ethereal, yet her smile remained heartbreakingly familiar. "Welcome back, Dad," she said, her voice carrying the same multi-layered harmonics. "Welcome to all of you." Parents rushed forward, embracing children who were simultaneously familiar and profoundly changed. There were tears, laughter, exclamations of disbelief and joy. Despite the physical alterations, the children retained their memories, their personalities, their connections to the families who had never stopped searching for them. Mark held Emily tightly, feeling the subtle vibration of energy beneath her skin. "Are you okay?" "I'm more than okay," she assured him. "We all are. The transformation is stabilizing. We've created something that's never existed before, a bridge between human consciousness and something greater." Colonel Brenner approached cautiously, still visibly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. "The government has questions, a lot of questions." Emily smiled. "We expected that. We're prepared to explain everything, what we are, what we're becoming, and why it matters." "And what happens next?" Mark asked. Emily looked around at the transformed chamber, at the parents reunited with their changed children, at the scientists documenting the unprecedented phenomenon, and at the military personnel struggling to categorize something that defied all existing protocols. "Cooperation," she said simply. "What happened to us was terrible, an accident born of scientific arrogance. But what we're becoming is necessary. Earth needs intermediaries for what's coming, not an invasion or a crisis, but a communion with intelligence beyond our current understanding." She took her father's hand, and once again Mark felt that momentary connection to something vast and ancient, yet newborn, a glimpse of cosmic awareness that both humbled and elevated him. "This is just the beginning," Emily said, gesturing to the colony that had grown from suffering and transformation. "The return isn't just ours. It's the return of something humanity once knew but has forgotten, that we're not alone and never have been." Mark squeezed his daughter's transformed hand, finally understanding that finding Emily had never been the end of the journey. It was merely the first step into something far greater, a future where humanity would face its greatest challenge, and with the help of 30 children who disappeared during a storm, perhaps its greatest evolution.